here we are, and an image occurs to me. If you know, like the old stories of the little Dutch boy who stuck his finger in the dike and kept the sea from overwhelming the land. Because where they claim the land back in Holland, it's lower than the sea, and they have these dikes up which keep the sea from coming back. And just his one little finger saved the whole city, and against the whole raging power of the sea and the great weight of the construction of that wall. So even though we're just a few little people here, and that's all we are, still it really matters what we do, what we say, what we understand, because our thoughts have, and our words and our understanding, they have a great influence on those around us. So it's very important, and so we should never be discouraged or wonder if maybe this is so little in face of such a big problem. I'm sure the missionaries think that way a little bit. They go like, well, great, we'll have a conference on gender and, the world will pass by and it'll be just very difficult. But that's not really the way it works, because in God's plan, the actions we perform that are motivated by charity, by love of God and neighbor, they have a power that's greater than any other in the world. That is, that just cannot be stopped. And so that charity in the part of each individual Christian is like the little finger in the dike. The world gives the appearance of strength and overwhelming power and great danger, but in point of fact, as St. John says, this is the victory that overcomes the world, your faith, he says. So just keep that in mind. So though we are few on this rainy day, that doesn't matter at all. In fact, it might be a sign that God has great things to do with your words and your thoughts. An example, when there are people, troubled people that you're dealing with who need a word of wisdom and consolation. So that's just to begin. That occurred to me, so we can all just say our prayers and just stick our finger in the dike and see what we can do. Now, before I begin the first talk, and that's the one which basically explains how we got to where we are now, and is a little more historical, you might say, or more philosophical. I just want to explain this image here because it might strike people as intriguing or interesting, or they want to know exactly who it is. And someone was asking who's the one in the middle. Of course, it's obvious that it's the Savior, the risen Savior, with his wounded side, and Our Lady showing her breast. In the middle is St. Augustine of Hippo, right? The father of the church, who is the doctor of grace and of charity. And broadly speaking, you'd say St. Maximilian Kolbe and the Franciscans, they were in that Augustinian tradition about the primacy of love. That's an important aspect of their charism and their tradition. So Augustine is kneeling in the middle. Now this was from a story that was told a lot in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, especially in Spain. This is a painting by Rubens. It's in the Real Academia de San Fernando in Madrid. And the story goes like this, that Augustine is saying, as he's kneeling there, placed in the middle, positus in medio, placed in the middle, I do not know which way to turn. Here I am fed by his side, and there I am nourished by her breast. Right. This is what you could call an ultra-Catholic image. It's unapologetic, no complexes, pre-Freudian, it's all just fine. It's beautiful man, beautiful woman, and a celibate mystic there who is completely enraptured by both of them and doesn't know which way to turn. Now, that gives us an intuitive thought about how the problems of the current culture can be resolved by the truths of our Catholic faith. And we can get to that later, but let's just say it might begin to occur to you what that would be. And of course, that has something to do with the little motto on the little blue book where it says, aim higher. The questions of sex and gender are always resolved by lifting them up to a higher level of existence that exists in God and the heavenly Jerusalem and the marriage banquet of the Lamb and in Jesus and Mary and the holy angels and all of the blessings that come from a freedom of chastity and acceptance of God's will in his creation. So this image kind of gives you a little picture of that in a way which could be also consoling. By the way, though, the typical Augustinian commentators on the picture say, well, he's actually going to turn towards Our Lady since that's what our Lord did. So they resolve it by saying, well, he actually ends up turning to her because, of course, Esau was daddy's boy and Jacob was mommy's boy, and Jacob turned out better. And of course, Jacob is in the teaching of St. Matthew Kolbe from St. Louis de Montfort is the image of the one consecrated to Our Lady. So they further complicate it, but we don't need to look at it as a competition. We need to look at it that we are overwhelmed once we get to the level of God's life. Then we're overwhelmed with the riches of all his creation, and that includes God, the image of God in human nature, male and female. It all belongs to us and to every one of us in the rightly understood way. And so we'll get back to that. But that's what this image is about. And I thought it would just be a nice way to have so that if my words sometimes don't hit the mark, this image will make an impression on your soul about where we can be and where we can lead others in relation to the things that really matter. So that's just an introduction there for this image. Now, so I'm going to need to use the board, so I'm thinking maybe I can't always use the microphone. Because I have to write. Well, I can just carry it with me, but it's kind of... As long as you can hear us, because the recording is coming here anyway, right? Yeah, okay, so that's all right. So I'll just move around. You can hear me. It's not an enormous auditorium. The first thing we want to talk about is, and let's see, you're going to let me know, what is the end time for this talk? Let's see, be 10:45? Okay, good. All right. Well, that's good. I just needed to have an idea there. Okay, so what we need to understand is first, how did our culture get to the point where the very notion that people are naturally male and female is regarded as an affront, as something for haters, as oppression? That's the way it's viewed now. I can read to you this little thing that they hand out in public schools to kids. Breaking the binary, getting rid of the binary between male and female. So what do we really have? We have gender identity. That's what you think about yourself. Gender expression, that's how you demonstrate your gender or not. And they're two different things. Then there's your biological sex. And then there's sexual orientation, who you're attracted to. So they divide it up into four things. That is basically what I think I am, how I act externally, and you can decide not to act externally according to what you think you are, if you want. And then your biological sex, which doesn't have anything essentially to do with what you think you are or how you conduct yourself. And then to what kinds of persons you might be attracted or not attracted. So it goes from two, male and female, to this four-part consideration. And of course, that's pretty complicated, but that's what people are being taught. It's a long way from, in the beginning, God created man, male and female, in his own image and likeness, male and female, he created them. It's a long way from that. But there's a reason why we got to where we are now, and it's one which can give you a little consolation and an insight into how we can begin to deal with people who have been afflicted with this particular ideology, this particular way of viewing the world, because it actually affects our entire culture, not just in matters of sexuality, but in every other area as well. Okay, so first of all, there is a view of reality that we can call the original view. That's what I call it, the original view. All right, so let's say original. Okay, the original view, which some people would call, in sort of a prejudiced way, pre-modern. But of course, the original view, the pre-modern view, is the view held right now by most of the billions of people that live on this world. Because the view of gender and sexuality that we have in our particular culture now is one which can only be held by people of a certain level of affluence and not people that live in cultures where your average woman has to spend 2 to 4 hours a day carrying water, okay? So I'm just saying, there's a lot of cultural and economic stuff behind this luxury of questioning all the basic categories of nature. So the pre-modern position doesn't mean it's not a current one, and we have to see what we mean by original. So there's the original point of view, then there is the modern point of view, which is sometimes called the Enlightenment. And then there is the postmodern point of view, which is called the deconstructed view. All right. This roughly means everything. If you want to look at history, you're talking about our culture up until the 16th century, okay? 16th, 17th century, right? And that has to do with the history of philosophy. That's, begins with people like Descartes and whatnot. So this is everything before then, the original point of view. And I'll tell you what it is in a minute, just so you know. But it kind of goes up till then, till the 1600s, okay? After the 1600s, you move into the modern period and finally the Enlightenment, where there's a particular view of human nature and philosophy that's very different from the previous one, but doesn't necessarily look very different. And then finally, in the 20th century, especially the middle to the late 20th century and presently, you have a perspective which rejects the Enlightenment and has its own postmodern perspective which deconstructs the whole process. Now, all this means quite simply, and that's all very abstract, but just to give you those three categories, all this means quite simply is that, but I like to use the word original because original means origin. Like, if you get My Prejudice, original is the original. It's like any product, you get the original one. This is like the locale, and this is, can't get it anymore, It's gone out of business. Okay, so, it goes that way, if you want to think of it in terms of products. So, what we have in the original point of view is a very simple and beautiful view of human nature, which you find in the sacred scriptures, in Greek philosophy, in the traditional theology of the church, or even of the synagogue, of the fathers and doctors of the church. And it views human nature as a microcosm. Now, what does that mean? A microcosm. Microcosm means a little universe. Human nature is viewed as having the capacity, through knowledge and love, to contain in itself everything in reality. Aristotle said, man by knowledge is all things. That is, that whatever there is in the entire universe, its whole span, can be contained in our souls and bodies and our relationship to the universe. So there's a macrocosm, the whole thing that God made, and then there's man made in his image and likeness, male and female, who contains, through knowledge and love, in his inner life and in his activity, everything whatsoever. And this is a point of view which is very innate in a truly spiritual and Christian understanding of the world, but which is not what we are taught, by our predominant culture right now. But if you read beautiful passages, say from St. Thomas or Duns Scotus also, so I have to mention him here, all right. So he views creation as an ordered reality that goes from the least of beings all the way to the highest angels through human nature to God. It's a chain of being, all right? The moderns would say it's a hierarchical view of being. You can say that, meaning that there's a sacred order, sacred origin. That's all. Hierarchy just means sacred origin or sacred cause. So it's not a bad word, all right? It's a holy origin, okay? So the universe where it builds up, there's an evolution which is, you would say, not over time, but just inserted in reality. So the lowest kind of being, to say a mineral, touches on the next highest kind of being, let's say some sort of virus or whatever it is we know exists, or cell, and then a mollusk that only has a reactive power but doesn't have any other senses. And you keep moving up the chain of being and the different kinds of realities until you get to sensitive life, beings that have the five senses and therefore can have feelings and movement and all of that. And the whole of creation moves towards, finally, the production by God of the human body as summing up everything below the human body. And the medievals call this complexion. You know, when you have the old-fashioned term, you say, well, you have a good complexion. That used to mean, it comes from a worldview where they said everything in your body works together to present on the external how you're doing physically. Okay, so human nature is built up and is at the pinnacle of the physical material world. And it contains all the things and all the perfections and all the powers of the beings that are below it. So we have all the aspects of being that lower beings have, but all summed up in our nature, just as we are. So we have an animal nature, we have our senses, but we also have a life of immaterial or material substances that we need in order for our functioning, minerals and vitamins and all kinds of other things that aren't actual living creatures, but constitute our nature. And of course, there's always water, all those things. Everything you find in creation, you find in the human body. In fact, you find it in a perfect balance so that man is able, human beings are able to represent in their own life the perfection of all the beings that are beneath them in the chain of being, in the lower level. Is that pretty clear? Clear enough? Just that, you know, everything that animals have, that plants have, that minerals have, you have summed up in your human body. That's the point, basically. Right. So, and this human body God made to be the pinnacle of the merely material world, so that in giving it a spiritual nature, it would also be the opening to the world of spirits, the world of immaterial beings, of God and of angels, and also introduce the personal spiritual order into the merely material and physical order, so that it's all summed up and spiritualized and made complete and whole in each one of the human beings that exists on the face of the earth, so that every single human soul is a microcosm that contains in itself the whole of that person's experience and can understand and envelop and desire or love anything whatsoever that God has made with the powers given in the human soul. That's why we see in human activity just the breadth of possibilities that exist in human beings. It's utterly astounding. And we have it all because we have this nature that sums it all up. We don't think of this because we take ourselves for granted, but we're actually, you know, very remarkable creatures and created by God precisely to bring this perfection to His material order. So the human body is made by God just to reach that pinnacle of material perfection, so that it can then, through our understanding and our spiritual nature, sum everything up also through knowledge and love. And so it's all there. If you ever see those images like of Leonardo da Vinci, where you have the man, he's like perfect shape, you know, like this, you know, and then it has all the different apexes, and it shows the connection of the heavenly bodies to the different parts of the human body. That's where the astrology came in back then, because they thought it was genuine science. So they said the different parts of the human body are ruled by the particular constellations, so that man sums up in his body the heavens, the passage of the stars and constellations throughout the year. And therefore your sign has to do with, you know, how your body relates to the universe. They regarded that as scientific. There's still plenty of people today that look at it, you know, and it's not that great an idea, but as long as you're not trying to predict the future, you know, buy the Farmer's Almanac, it'll tell you when to plant your tomatoes, and it says, you know, do it, you know, when the moon is in whatever, in Taurus or something like that. So it just, you know, this is popular wisdom. But in any case, the view of the universe is precisely that, where man himself, and I just use it that way because we're, you know, among friends, and I know that's provocative, but speaking of the original point of view, we might as well use the language of the original point of view. So man sums up in himself everything below himself, and then is open and is able to receive and participate in everything above himself, because he has a spiritual nature that's potentially unlimited. And so we're right at the pinnacle of material creation, but we're open to everything above us, from the Blessed Trinity all the way down, in the company and community of the saints and our eternal destiny in the life of heaven. So Then, when you say that human nature was created by God in God's image and likeness, and of course God contains in himself the ideas and the power, he's the cause of the whole universe. So when he makes us in his image, he makes us participate in that fullness of what he has in himself, both in our physical nature and also in our potentialities of knowledge and love. And there's no end to that. We have an infinite potency or ability to come to know things and to come to love things. There isn't any limit to it. One of the tragedies of human life is when people get to a certain point in life and they lose interest in new things because they figure, well, it's already too late. You know, when I was younger, I would have done that. And you have to say, well, no, but I mean, keep reading, keep studying, keep reaching out, you know, keep those neural pathways going and whatnot, because, you know, your human nature is of such a great dignity that even if you're just, you know, reading the day you die, you know, it's not a loss. You know, it's not a loss at all. I remember very well the story. You've heard the story about St. Aloysius Gonzaga, where he was playing soccer with the seminarians, and someone said, "What would you do if you knew that you were going to die in a minute?" And he said, "I would keep playing soccer." Right? He was ready, you know, and he had that integrated sense of the saints that everything comes from God, and if we're living a life which is truly of knowledge and love, then we're able to include all of that in our love for God and love for neighbor. That doesn't mean that another person might have needed to stop and, you know, make an act of contrition, but, you know, that depends on the person. But let's just say, so that original view is a view of the perfect integrity of human nature as a microcosm, summing up everything under God, and then made in his image. Now, being made in God's image, it immediately says in Scripture, male and female, he created them. Now, what's that all about? It seems like he could have just made human nature as such without the division of sexes. But there's one little problem in that regard that might not occur to you because it seems so natural, but it's something which has to be if we have a bodily nature. If we're pure spirits, then pure spirits are each one unique individuals. They're created directly by God, like the human soul is created by God and fused in the body. So every angel is a unique individual. Angels don't have fathers and mothers. They're not part of a family. Each one is totally and completely his own nature, his own self. So St. Michael is Michaelness, and St. Raphael is Raphaelness, and your guardian angel is his own kind. Each angel is a separate species in the angelic world, right? Completely different from the other one, because they're made all directly by God. They don't have bodies, okay? So they're just made by God that way. So, but if you have a bodily nature that then has to be multiplied in individuals, there has to be some kind of union of bodily nature to multiply the individuals. It's a necessity of having a body, that bodily natures, when they are increased or perfected, they require a procreation. And that's the necessity of having a body. You have to be ordered towards procreation if you have a physical body and you're a living sentient being. And that it's some mechanism in every single being. That's the organization of organisms. You know, if you learn that in biology, you know that you can see what the whole thing is ordered for. Now, in our case then, if you have a body, right, our kind is not made up of unique beings, each one of a different kind. We come from somebody else, and that has to occur. It begins with Adam, but where does Eve come from? From Adam's side. And he says, this at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And so she'll be called woman because she was taken from her man, right? And that is the completeness of the fullness of human nature. And it's there so that our nature, which sums up the whole creation, can be also reproduced in numerous, potentially infinite number of individuals who each one is a new microcosm. A little like the angels, because able to take everything in and to love God and to reach a spiritual and supernatural destiny, but having something no angel is able to have. That is the power, the innate power to sum up God's lower creation, which is extremely beautiful and which the angels minister to and protect and guide under God, according to the teaching of the fathers. So a body nature requires the existence of sex, of male and female. So that it's a requirement of our kind, because we're made in God's image, as physical material beings, we must be male and female, so as to continue that kind throughout time until the number of God's elect is fulfilled in the kingdom of heaven. Right? So that is, what I'm giving here, that's the original point of view. So that the male and female is innate to human nature, not because a woman is not made in the image of God and a man is, but both are made in God's image and likeness. But to have that image and likeness in human nature continue, there have to be new human beings. And human beings are liable to death. We saw that with Adam and Eve. And so consequently you have procreation. And that's the necessity there. And that was just simply understood. And you get it in all the fathers and doctors of the Middle Ages. They just understand that being male and female, it's not an essential quality of your spiritual life, but it's an essential quality of your human nature, which is made in God's image so that you can have a spiritual and supernatural life. So it's not the most important or sublime thing about human nature, but it is essential to human nature in order for it to continue. That's why when you read things in Scripture that seem to relativize the importance of sex or gender, in Christ there's neither male nor female. But on the other hand, we read, it's the wedding feast of the Lamb and his bride is prepared to welcome him. So the basic images and understanding of what God has in store for us in the kingdom of heaven are based upon our physical human nature and that nature which we understand to possess, and in the light of which we understand spiritual things as microcosms of spiritual things and material things. Okay, any questions up to this point? All right. Hope it's not too bizarre for you. Because no one thinks about this point of view because it's so basic. And it's just taken for granted in every culture, and they have different ways of viewing it, but it's essential to see that our dignity as persons and as spiritual beings made in God's image is not completely independent of our sex, even though they're not exactly the same thing. As St. Augustine said, if Adam had needed a friend, God would have created another man. What he needed was a helpmate to continue the human race in the sublime charity of giving other beings their life and existence. He just didn't need companionship, okay? Now, companionship between the sexes is a great thing, but let's just say the deep reason for male and female has to do with the common good of the human race, and that has to do with love in the strongest sense of the term. That is, bestowing something for the sake of others and not simply achieving satisfaction for oneself. And that's why marriage is a sacrifice and friendship can be just a lark. And that's why guys like to hang out with their pals and women like to hang out with their female friends sometimes more than they like hanging out with each other, at least after a certain point. But that's just an aside. So that's sort of the original view. But once we get to the Enlightenment, we have another little problem. And this is that the view of human nature changes because the view of the cosmos, of the universe, changes. Between the pre-modern point of view and the modern point of view, what happens? You get Copernicus and Galileo. They find out the Earth's not the center of the universe and that things are much farther away than we thought. And that the constellations don't really, pass over the Earth. They're like, millions of miles away from each other, but they look from a certain point of view on the world to be a certain way. And so they're not there in our galaxy or in our solar system passing along with the planets. And that's what rendered the whole of their point of view regarding the material universe outmoded. And so that led to a crisis into how to view human nature. Like, well, if this isn't reliable anymore, what are we to do? Okay. Now, I have an answer to that, which I'll give you in a minute, but I hope you'll notice when I give it. I'll have to underline it. But the answer they came up with was simply to focus on the fact that human nature consists exclusively, really, of consciousness, of being aware, of thinking. And the relationship between the human person and the body was a relationship of a mind to an instrument or a tool for the mind's use. So there's no longer the identity where human nature is body and soul completely, so that you're human, your body and soul, and not merely one or merely the other, but a union of the two, so that you touch my body, you touch me. But you also affect my soul and my inner life. All of that is changed to a view which says, well, basically human beings are thinking beings, rational beings, and human life is about consciousness and rationality. And the body is simply an instrument or a tool for human life. It's just something we use, but it's not our deepest nature. The reason for that is and this is the crisis, because they could no longer trust the senses. They said, well, our senses told us that the universe was like that, and now we see that we can't rely on our senses. So what you get from your body is just something your mind uses, but it can't rest in it. It can't be sure of anything based upon it. It just has to make use of it for the conveniences of life. But people are basically rational consciousnesses, thinking beings, and their bodies aren't essential to their nature. Now, that you can see where that's moving in the direction of where we're going to get, but it's still a long way off from it. Any questions about that particular point? All right, it's clear enough. So we go from man as a microcosm, summing up in himself, in body and in soul, everything that exists, the lower creation, his own personal experience, and then the higher world of the angels and God, and everything else besides. That universalized view, what you see in the mystics and the saints and the philosophers, where there's this breadth and like with John of the Cross, mine of the heavens, mine of the earth, everything is mine because I belong to Christ and Christ is the head of everything, that perspective to this perspective where there's an anxious view of I don't have certainty, and so I have to rely simply on my reason, and I can't trust the traditions that have been handed on to me, except in a practical way, because you can't live without living normally with people. And so you don't regard the things that regard your sensible life, your material life, your bodily life as certain. You just regard them as maybe just useful or necessary. And so this particular point of view, of course, then, as I said, it turns man from a microcosm to just a consciousness, or just a reason. And then the relationship with the body, and that means everything that has to do with the body, so material possessions, experiences, social customs, everything has to do with relating to something that you can take in your senses, that becomes a question of just practical use. And so this is the birth of what I could call just mere conservatism. What I mean by that is that, I don't mean political conservatism, I mean the idea that, well, you have to live a normal life, and so you accept the basic customs and traditions and presuppositions of your culture, and that includes also your religion and morality, but only because they're conventional, they're just things that we do in order to live practically with each other, but they're not scientific, they're not fully rational, they're just customary. And any normal person, you would say, well, I'd like to get along with everybody and live happily in the culture in which I was raised. And so I live as though all those things were absolutely true, but I'm not rationally certain of them. And so you get the cleavage between rational scientific knowledge and just the life of custom and observance and culture. And this totally took over in our civilization. But people didn't notice it because it wasn't externally all that different. It went from being an absolute certainty about the nature of things based upon God's creation and its entire order, spiritual and physical, to a skeptical view of anything that could come from the senses, combined with a focus just on pure rationality. So when you went to school then, you learned good manners and you were supposed to, behave a certain way because you're in a particular culture. But if you really pushed, especially if you got to university, is all this stuff certain? Is there any way to know it for sure? Do we really have to believe this? The answer would be, no, it's not scientific, it's not rational, all it is custom. But it's better to observe custom. And Descartes, the famous philosopher who started all this, he came up with that idea. He said, well, we need to reconstruct the whole way we think, but just like when you tear down your old house, you have to be in a new one for a while until another one, provisional one for a while until the new one is built. So we just stay in the house that we have at hand while we're constructing the new one, and then we tear the old house down. So I will take as certain, he says, in practice the religion and customs of my country, France, and I have to live that way. But it's not because it's certain, it's just because practically can't live otherwise. And so everything that has to do with all that beauty of the whole of creation leading up to human nature and all the stuff about angels and God and human nature summing up everything, that beautiful image that was so traditional, and you find again, I say, in the mystics, philosophers, poets, in every part of their culture, that just becomes fine if you like it and practically necessary, but not at all a depiction of reality. Reality becomes geometry, algebra, physics, and political theory, and a lot of other things like that, but definitely on the level of just a pure rationality. So we get to the age of consciousness. Now, this, of course, is moving then towards the view which we call postmodern, where finally this insistence on reason is questioned. And this is where the gender ideology comes. The insistence that words have definite meanings and that texts that you read have a meaning which the original author said they meant, and which you have to interpret them according to what the original author said. You get a whole ideology, which is from the mid-20th century to now, which says no, words don't have stable meanings, just because even the sensible universe that we have doesn't have a stable meaning. Texts that we read of philosophers or of scripture or anything in culture, they're just pure signs with no content that is reliable or certain. And this is actually what is taught. And I'm just putting it in the crudest possible terms. It's a very sophisticated philosophy, and it's very interesting but difficult to pursue. But you basically take it apart. You just deconstruct, take it apart. So we have the fullness of human nature, microcosm, a kind of low-cal version, as I said, where it's reduced just to reason, and then accommodation to other things that are not rational or scientific. And then finally we get the postmodern version where everything's taken apart in the name of a relativization of all meaning whatsoever. All meaning whatsoever. And then this becomes a political ideology where they say, if you insist that this text means something, you are oppressing me. You are hindering my own interpretation and self-expression. So, Professor, you can't tell me what Shakespeare meant by this, because I'm a postmodern feminist, and even the word feminist is a little bit, old-fashioned at this point, to say the very least. But let's just say, you can't tell me what this means because there isn't any such thing as a stable meaning for words. So it goes from things being taken as creations of God in the original view, with their own consistent nature, which exists to be perfected and taken up in the human body, and then as the foundation for a spiritual knowledge of God and spiritual things, and also foundation for the incarnation of God's Son. It goes from that, where it's all reality, it's all real, and yet it's also thinking and loving, to it's just thinking, and the rest of it's kind of, we're not so sure about it, and that's why rational justification of culture or bodily nature is just kind of difficult to come by. And now we have it where even words don't have a stable meaning, even the power of communication. And this is where we are now. The gender theory has a lot to do with the use of words. Words left, like in the world of Humpty Dumpty, words mean whatever I want them to mean, nothing more, nothing less. If you've ever read Humpty Dumpty, okay. So that you're left with a very simple thing, and this is the reduction of human nature and human discourse not to the nature of things under God, not to consciousness and reason, which already looks pretty nice from the point of view of what we have now. That's the old-fashioned approach. See, that's the conservative approach. You hold on to it because it's what you've been doing, not because it's absolutely true. But then here, when you get to postmodern, what do you have? You have the elimination of words as having a permanent meaning. So you eliminate genuine communication, and it's reduced simply to what? We've gotten the mind, we've got reality, we've got the mind. What other is the big human spiritual faculty? Is you have understanding and you have will. All right, it's just reduced to will. And will, and of course then, of course, passions, because of course we still have bodies. And so my nature is determined by my will and by my desires, period. And you can't tell me what to think or what to say or what my words mean. And that is the sum total of an understanding of nature. It's completely torn apart. It's deconstructed. It's just in pieces there. Now you could say, look, I can take this for you, and it's a big puzzle here, and you've broken it apart, and we can kind of put it all back together again. But they would say, how dare you insist on reconstructing something which is just another piece? That is, you can put it all back together again, and they say, fine, might as well be one piece of the puzzle as the whole thing. It doesn't matter, right? And that's the underlying fundamental philosophical perspective that has led to all this gender ideology. Now, that's hard to get our minds around because it's so profoundly contrary to our understanding of what makes sense. You know, normally we say words make sense, but you say, no, they don't. Words are expression of my will. That's why you have all of this stuff on the campuses right now, the Antifa people and whatnot, where there's no acceptance of rational discourse in academia. You know, when they say you're not allowed, you know, they will not let people speak whom they disagree with. They attack professors just for holding the most innocent Enlightenment views. They're not even, you know, medieval Christians. They're just innocent Enlightenment views about justice and liberty and human dignity and all that. And they get in your face. You can see the films of the kids saying, you're to listen to me. You have no right to speak back to me. They don't accept the nice Enlightenment views that, well, because we're rational, we have rights. That's all for the patriarchy. That's all to oppress somebody else. And what really exists is my independent will. And that's what society, if it exists at all, exists to foster, to let me be exactly as I please. And then you have to find out what words you can use in talking to me, because we won't have a common vocabulary. And that's why there's a constant shift in terminology, and it will be endless because there isn't any way to stop it. Once you separate from nature and then separate, which is the first stage, the microcosm, then you separate from rationality, the second stage. What are you left with? You're left with just nothing to talk about, no way to make the point. And this is the difficulty here, and then we're left to just the will and the passions. It's very simple if you just consider someone who is bent on a particular point of view that is not reasonable or right, but they're focused on it, and you try to reason with them, your words won't mean a thing. They'll just cause anger and resentment. If someone is determined to live a certain way, and this has always been true, because what this is actually these three stages are a little picture of what human beings can do in each human life. You can live in integrity and completeness under God the way He made you, or you can kind of begin to separate from the basic principles and live on the level of your inner life and not really interact with the full reality that God made. And that happens in human lives. And then if you're bent on something wrong, or you're just simply terrified or something, then you lapse into not being able to be reasoned with at all. And people have to kind of take care of you and keep that in mind all the time when they're dealing with you. Don't bring that up. Oh no, you know, we see that in families. Don't bring that up, or you'll pay the price. You know, and it occurs in the communities and elsewhere. So those are the three stages in the history of philosophy, if you will. So you've basically gotten a really quick presentation of the history of philosophy in the ancient Greece, Rome, Middle Ages, Europe, and the United States, and England, and France, and whatnot. That's what this all has been. Because this is the ancient, modern, and postmodern. But no one should ever say that ideas that people teach in universities, in classes, crazy notions, don't eventually matter. Because this stuff has been taught in universities very consistently, so that now they talk about, in the postmodern world, they say the post-human age. And that's where we are now. How dare you say that a robot has less dignity than a human being? No, we're there. We're there, okay? We're there. And we're not even, and this was just 20 years ago, you think, oh, that's never going to happen. It's so crazy. Well, so that's the world we're in. So it's post-humanity, if you will, which is what you've done, is you've deconstructed humanity. It's no longer male or female. It's not made in God's image. It's not even necessarily dignified. It's not even part of creation. There is no creation. So that's the That's the bleak presentation. But there is an upside, which I will talk about in the next talk.